The bell above the door of the small coffee shop had a familiar, cheerful chime, a sound that usually meant the arrival of a friend, a regular customer, or someone just seeking refuge from the bustle of the street. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, however, the chime seemed to hang in the air differently, a note of discord in the carefully composed symphony of the café. The low hum of conversation, punctuated by the hiss of the espresso machine and the gentle clinking of ceramic mugs, faltered for a beat. It was a subtle shift, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. A few people glanced up from their laptops, their eyes briefly drawn to the doorway before returning to their screens, their minds already re-immersing in work or study. The initial disturbance was fleeting, and the comfortable, predictable rhythm of the place began to reassert itself, but then a quiet stillness began to creep through the room, a slow-spreading silence that was much more profound than the brief pause caused by the bell. It started near the entrance and rippled outwards, one table at a time. A young woman typing furiously on her keyboard stopped, her fingers hovering over the keys. A small group of friends laughing over a shared phone screen gradually quieted down, their smiles fading as they felt the change in the atmosphere. The source of this unsettling calm was the man who had just entered. He was not causing a scene. He was not speaking loudly or demanding attention. In fact, he was doing the opposite. He was standing perfectly still just inside the door, as if he was afraid to take up any more space than he absolutely had to. And his very stillness was a disruption. He was a tall man, but he seemed to shrink into himself. His shoulders slumped forward as if carrying a weight that no one else could see. His frame was gaunt, his cheekbones sharp and prominent under skin that looked thin and fragile, almost translucent. His face was a map of hardship, lined with deep creases that spoke of countless sleepless nights and days spent under a harsh sun. But it was his eyes that held the room's attention. They were a deep, dark brown, and they were filled with a profound and bottomless weariness. It wasn't the tiredness of a long day at work or a sleepless night. It was a much deeper exhaustion, the kind that settles into a person's very soul after weeks, or maybe even months, of struggle. His clothes hung loosely on his thin body. They were not rags, but they were worn and faded, a testament to a time when they had fit better and perhaps been newer. A frayed collar on his jacket and a small, almost invisible tear in the sleeve of his shirt told a story of a slow, gradual decline rather than a sudden fall. He carried nothing with him, no bag, no phone, no possessions of any kind. He had only the clothes on his back and the quiet dignity with which he stood, his gaze cast down towards the worn wooden floorboards. He was an invisible man, the kind people hurry past on the street without a second glance. But here, in the warm, close confines of the coffee shop, he had become impossible to ignore. The man's eyes slowly lifted from the floor, and for the first time they focused on something specific. His gaze drifted past the people, past the tables and chairs, and settled on the long glass counter at the back of the shop. Behind the counter, under warm, inviting lights, was a display of pastries and sandwiches. Flaky croissants, glistening with a sugary glaze, sat next to oversized muffins bursting with blueberries. There were ham and cheese sandwiches on freshly baked bread and little pots of fruit salad that looked bright and cheerful. The look on his face as he stared at the food was one of pure, unadulterated longing. It wasn't a greedy or demanding look, but one of deep, simple need, the way a man lost in the desert for days might look at a glass of water. His hunger was a palpable thing, an aura that seemed to surround him. And it was so intense that a few people in the shop felt a strange, uncomfortable pang in their own stomachs. The silence in the room was now complete, broken only by the low, steady hum of the refrigerator. The air felt thick with unspoken questions and a collective sense of awkwardness. People didn't know where to look. Some stared openly, their expressions a mixture of pity, curiosity, and suspicion. Others looked away, suddenly finding their own coffee cups incredibly interesting, uncomfortable with the raw display of need. A businessman in a crisp suit, who had been barking orders into his phone just moments before, ended his call abruptly and began packing his laptop into his bag, his movements stiff and hurried. As if he couldn't get away from the uncomfortable situation fast enough, the young woman in the corner, the one who had been typing, felt a wave of sympathy wash over her. She saw not a threat or an inconvenience, but a fellow human being who was clearly in pain. She thought about the half-eaten scone on her plate, a treat she was now too full to finish, and a pang of guilt twisted in her gut. She wanted to offer it to him, but she hesitated, held back by a strange, invisible wall of social etiquette. Would it be an act of kindness, or would it be an act of condescension? She didn't want to embarrass him, and so she did nothing. Her hands frozen in her lap, behind the counter, the owner of the shop, a woman in her late 40s with a kind but tired face, watched the scene unfold. She had seen her share of hard luck stories in this neighborhood. People came in all the time asking for a spare change or for a cup of water on a hot day. She had a policy of being firm but fair, helping when she could but not allowing her business to be taken advantage of. She wiped down the counter with a clean cloth, her eyes never leaving the stranger. She was trying to read him, to understand his intentions. He wasn't holding out a cup or asking for anything. He was just standing there, a silent, hungry silhouette against the afternoon light streaming through the window. There was a quiet dignity about him that was different, and it made her pause. He looked like a man who was down on his luck, not a man looking for a handout. He looked like he was trying to figure out his next move, and the whole coffee shop was holding its breath, waiting to see what it would be. The silence in the coffee shop had become a heavy, living thing. It pressed down on everyone, making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. The stranger, who had been a still, silent statue by the door, finally moved. It was a slow, deliberate movement, as if his joints were stiff and his muscles ached with the effort. He took a single step forward, and the sound of his worn, scuffed shoe scraping against the worn wooden floor seemed to echo in the quiet room. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes was fixed on him. He was no longer just a part of the scenery. He was the main character in a story that no one had expected to be a part of that afternoon. He walked towards the counter, his steps hesitant but purposeful. He kept his gaze low, focused on the path ahead of him, as if he was afraid of what he might see in the faces of the people he was passing. He could feel their stares on him, a physical weight on his shoulders. He felt the judgment, the pity, the fear, and the curiosity, all blending into a suffocating cloud. He just wanted to reach the counter, to make his offer, and to either be accepted or rejected quickly, so he could escape from the suffocating warmth. And the prying eyes of this place, the woman behind the counter watched him approach. She had seen a lot of people come and go from her little shop over the years. She had seen the rich and powerful, the struggling students, the young couples in love, and the lonely souls seeking a moment of comfort in a warm cup of coffee. She had developed a sense for people, an ability to read their intentions and their needs. As this man drew closer, she felt a mix of emotions. There was a part of her, the business owner, that was wary. She had a business to run, and she couldn't have people causing a scene or making her other customers uncomfortable. She had a policy, a set of rules that she tried to follow, to keep order and to ensure that her small corner of the world remained a safe and welcoming space for everyone, but there was another part of her, the human being that saw something else in this man. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion etched onto his face, the slight tremor in his hands, and the raw, desperate hunger in his eyes. She saw a man who was at the end of his rope, a man who had lost everything but was still trying to hold on to a shred of his dignity. He wasn't aggressive or demanding. He was quiet, respectful, and almost apologetic for the space he was taking up. She felt a tug of empathy, a deep instinctual urge to help, to do something, anything, to ease the suffering she saw in front of her. He finally reached the counter, and he stopped, standing a few feet away from her, as if not wanting to invade her personal space. He looked up, and for the first time his eyes met hers. They were a deep, dark brown, and they were filled with a vulnerability that was almost painful to witness. He took a deep, shaky breath, as if he was about to say something that he had been rehearsing in his mind for a long time. The whole room was leaning in, listening, waiting. "Ma'am," he began, his voice barely a whisper, It was a raspy, rough sound like stones grinding together, a voice that had clearly not been used much lately. He cleared his throat, a small, embarrassed cough, and tried again. "Ma'am," he said, a little louder this time, his voice still trembling slightly. I don't have any money." A few people in the room shifted in their seats, their suspicions confirmed. A man in an expensive suit who was getting his coffee to go let out an audible sigh of impatience. He looked at his watch as if to signal that his time was being wasted. The young woman in the corner, however, leaned forward, her expression one of intense focus and quiet encouragement. She wanted him to succeed, to find a moment of grace in this difficult situation. The stranger seemed to sense the mixed reactions in the room. He flinched slightly at the man's sigh, but he took another deep breath and continued, his eyes still fixed on the woman behind the counter. "But I can sing," he said, his voice a little stronger now, a little more confident. "I would be grateful for the chance to earn a meal. Just one song for a cup of soup and some coffee." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated shock. No one had expected that. They had expected him to ask for money, for a handout, for a free cup of coffee. They had prepared themselves for that, to either look away or to reach into their pockets. But they had not prepared for this, for an offer, for a trade, for a man who had nothing, offering something of himself in exchange for a moment of sustenance. The woman behind the counter was taken aback. She looked at the man, really looked at him, trying to see past the dirt and the weariness, to see the person who was standing in front of her. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of hope, a desperate plea for a chance. She thought about her policy, about the rules of her business. But then she thought about the human being in front of her, a man who was willing to bare his soul, to risk ridicule and rejection. For a simple cup of soup, she looked around the room at the faces of her customers. She saw the impatient man, the curious students, the sympathetic woman. She knew that whatever she did next would be judged, that she would be setting a precedent. But she also knew that this was not just about business. This was about humanity. This was about a moment of connection, a chance to make a small difference in someone's life. She took a deep breath, and she made a decision. She looked the man straight in the eye, and she gave him a small, gentle smile. "All right," she said softly, her voice filled with a warmth and kindness that seemed to fill the entire room. "One song." A wave of relief washed over the stranger's face. His shoulders, which had been tensed up with anxiety, seemed to relax, and a small, grateful smile touched his lips. He nodded, a simple, silent gesture of thanks. The woman gestured towards a small, open space near the counter, a little stage for his impromptu performance. The room was still silent, but now it was a silence of anticipation, of waiting. Everyone was leaning in, their hearts open, their minds ready to listen. The stranger took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and prepared to sing. The small space near the counter that the woman had indicated felt like the largest stage in the world to the stranger. Every eye in the coffee shop was on him, a silent jury of strangers about to pass judgment on his one and only asset. He could feel their skepticism like a physical presence in the air. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of doubt. The man in the expensive suit had his arms crossed, his expression a clear mixture of impatience and disdain. A couple of teenagers in the corner were smirking at each other, whispering behind their hands. They were expecting a joke, a pathetic, off-key tune that would give them something to talk about later. Even the young woman who had shown him sympathy looked on with a gentle but worried expression, as if she was afraid he was about to make a fool of himself. The stranger took a deep, shaky breath, the air catching in his chest. He closed his eyes, shutting out the faces, the judgment, the entire world. For a moment he was no longer in a warm coffee shop. He was back on a cold street, the wind biting at his face, the gnawing ache of hunger a constant companion in his empty stomach. He remembered the countless doors that had been slammed in his face, the people who had looked right through him as if he were made of glass. He remembered the shame, the loneliness, and the slow, crushing weight of despair. All of that pain, all of that history, was channeled into the single breath he was about to release. And then he opened his mouth. What came out was not the hesitant, cracked sound anyone was expecting. It was a single, clear note that seemed to materialize out of thin air, a sound so pure and so powerful that it physically startled the room. It was a resonant, velvet baritone, a voice that seemed to belong in a grand concert hall, not in a small corner coffee shop. The note was so full and rich that it seemed to absorb all the other sounds in the room, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic noise from the street. All of it vanished. Consumed by the sheer beauty of that one sound, the man in the suit, who had been tapping his foot impatiently, froze. His arms uncrossed and his mouth fell slightly open. The smirk on the teenagers' faces was wiped away, replaced by a look of wide-eyed disbelief. The young woman in the corner let out a soft, audible gasp. Her hand flying to her mouth, the stranger began to sing. It was an old, soulful folk ballad, a song about a lost traveler wandering through a dark and lonely valley, searching for a path he couldn't find. The lyrics spoke of hardship and longing, of a deep, aching desire for a place to call home. As he sang, his voice carried a weight of emotion that was almost unbearable to witness. It was a voice that had known suffering, a voice that had been to the edge of despair and had somehow found its way back. Every note was filled with a raw, heartbreaking honesty. A confession of a life lived on the margins. He sang about the cold winds that had battered him, and the people in the room could almost feel a chill in the warm, cozy cafe. He sang about the darkness that had surrounded him, and the afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to dim, as if in deference to his sorrow. He sang about the hunger that had gnawed at his soul, not just for food, but for connection, for dignity, for a simple act of kindness. His voice was not just a sound. It was a story. It was his story, laid bare for everyone to hear. As he moved into the chorus, his voice soared, filling the small space with a sound that seemed to expand the walls. It was a sound of incredible power and control, a testament to a talent that had been honed by years of practice, a talent that had been buried under layers of hardship and neglect. The businessman, who had been packing his laptop into his bag, stopped what he was doing and just stood there, his bag forgotten at his feet. He was completely captivated, his usual air of impatience and self-importance replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated awe. He was no longer seeing a homeless man. He was seeing an artist, a master of his craft. The young woman in the corner, who had been so full of sympathy, was now quietly crying. The tears streamed down her face, but she made no sound. She wasn't crying out of pity anymore. She was crying because the music was so beautiful, so full of pain and hope, that it had touched something deep inside her, a part of her that she rarely let anyone see. The song was speaking to her own hidden sorrows, her own secret longings, and she felt a connection to this stranger, a shared humanity that transcended their different circumstances. The song continued, each verse a new chapter in the traveler's journey, each chorus a powerful plea for redemption. The stranger was no longer just standing in a coffee shop. He was in his own world, a world of music and emotion, and he was taking everyone in the room with him. The air was thick with a collective, unspoken feeling. It was a mixture of shock, of wonder, of guilt, and of a profound, overwhelming empathy. People were not just listening to a song. They were experiencing a moment of pure, unfiltered truth. As the song began to wind down, the stranger's voice softened, becoming more intimate, more pleading. The final verse was about a flicker of light in the distance, a distant star in the dark valley, a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, the traveler was not lost after all. His voice was filled with a fragile, tentative hope, a feeling that was both heartbreaking and incredibly moving. He sang the last line, a simple, poignant question about finding a way home, and then he let the final note hang in the air. It was a long, sustained note, a sound that seemed to hold all the pain and all the hope of the entire song. It filled the room, wrapping around every person present, a warm, vibrating blanket of pure emotion. And then, slowly, gently, it faded away, leaving a silence in its wake that was more profound, more meaningful, than any sound they had ever heard. The stranger opened his eyes. For a moment he looked dazed, as if he had just woken from a dream. He looked around the room, his gaze slowly taking in the faces of the people who were staring at him. He saw the tears on the young woman's face. He saw the look of awe on the businessman's face. He saw the teenagers no longer smirking, but looking at him with a newfound respect. He saw the woman behind the counter, her hand on her heart, her eyes shining with tears. He had expected ridicule, or at best, polite indifference. He had not expected this. He had not expected to see his own pain reflected in the eyes of a room full of strangers. He had not expected his song to shake them so deeply. And in that moment, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a sense of worth. The last note of the stranger's song faded into the air, but it didn't disappear. It seemed to hang there, a ghost of a sound, vibrating in the quiet space of the coffee shop. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The room was held captive by a silence so profound it felt sacred. It was the kind of silence that follows a moment of pure, unadulterated truth. A moment where the artificial barriers between people crumble, leaving only raw, exposed emotion. The man who had entered as an invisible stranger, a source of discomfort and suspicion, had, in the space of a single song, become the center of everyone's universe. The first sound to break the silence was a soft, choked sob. It came from the young woman in the corner. She quickly covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking as she tried to contain the wave of emotion that had washed over her. Her tears were not just for the sad song or the beautiful voice. They were for the man himself, for the pain he had carried and the beauty he had created from it. Her quiet sob was like a signal, a release valve for the tension that had been building in the room. Then a single person began to clap. It was an older man, a retired professor who was a regular at the shop, sitting alone with a book. He slowly raised his hands and brought them together in a deliberate, respectful gesture. His clap was loud in the quiet room, and it was followed by another, and then another. Soon, the entire coffee shop erupted in a thunderous, heartfelt applause. It wasn't the polite, perfunctory clapping one might give to a street performer. It was a wave of sound, a torrent of appreciation and awe that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small building. People were on their feet, their faces flushed with emotion. Their applause a desperate attempt to give back a fraction of what they had just received. The stranger, whose name they still did not know, opened his eyes. He looked around the room, his expression one of utter shock and disbelief. He had braced himself for awkward silence, for smirks, for a quick dismissive thank you. He had not prepared for this. He had not prepared for a standing ovation. He took a small, involuntary step back, as if the force of their appreciation was a physical thing that he was not strong enough to withstand. A single tear traced a path down his weathered cheek, a testament to the overwhelming flood of emotions he was experiencing. The woman behind the counter was the first to move. The applause was still echoing in the room as she bustled out from behind the counter, her movements quick and purposeful. Her face was wet with tears, but her expression was one of fierce determination. She had made a deal for a cup of soup and a coffee, but that simple transaction now felt laughably inadequate. It felt like an insult. She went to the warmer where the soups were kept and ladled out a large, steaming bowl of chicken noodle soup, making sure to include plenty of chicken and vegetables. She grabbed a fresh, crusty roll from a basket and placed it on a plate. Then she poured a large black coffee into a sturdy ceramic mug. She didn't just grab the first thing she could find. She prepared the meal with a care and a generosity that went far beyond the terms of their agreement. She walked over to a small, empty table near the window and carefully placed the food down. Then she turned to the stranger, who was still standing in the middle of the room, looking lost and overwhelmed. "It's on the house," she said, her voice thick with emotion but firm and clear. "Please eat." She gestured towards the table, a warm, inviting smile on her face. "And when you're done, we'll talk about dessert." The stranger looked at her, his eyes wide with gratitude. He nodded, unable to speak, and slowly made his way to the table. He sat down, his movements stiff and unsure, as if he was afraid the chair might disappear from under him. He looked at the food in front of him, the steam rising from the soup, the golden brown crust of the roll. The dark, rich coffee, and for a moment he just stared, as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. As he sat down, the applause began to die down, but the atmosphere of connection and goodwill remained. A few patrons approached him, their hesitation replaced by a desire to connect, to offer their own small piece of kindness. The businessman in the expensive suit, who had been so impatient just a few minutes before, was the first to reach him. He pulled a crisp $50 bill from his wallet and placed it on the table next to the stranger's plate. That was incredible," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "Please take this, and I'm sorry for my attitude earlier." He didn't wait for a response, but simply nodded, his own eyes a little glassy, and walked out of the shop, his briefcase forgotten in his hand. Next, the young woman who had been crying approached the table. She didn't have any money to give, but she wanted to offer something. She leaned down and whispered, "Thank you. Your song, it was exactly what I needed to hear today." She gave him a small, genuine smile, and he nodded in return, a flicker of understanding passing between them. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated human connection, a shared acknowledgement of the pain and beauty that existed in the world. Then, a man who had been sitting quietly in the corner, observing everything, approached the table. He was a music teacher at a local college, and he had been stunned by the stranger's natural talent and raw emotion. He pulled a business card from his pocket and wrote a phone number on the back. "I don't know what your story is," he said, his voice kind and respectful, "but you have a gift. A real gift. If you ever need a place to practice, or if you want to talk about anything, please give me a call. My services would be free." The stranger looked at the card, then at the man, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. He was not used to this kind of kindness, this outpouring of generosity from people he had never met. He was used to being ignored, to being shooed away, to being treated as a nuisance. This was a completely new experience, and it was almost more overwhelming than the hunger and the loneliness he had endured for so long. He picked up the spoon, his hand trembling slightly. He dipped it into the soup and brought a small, careful spoonful to his lips. The warmth of the broth, the savory flavor of the chicken and vegetables, the comforting softness of the noodles, it was a sensory explosion, a symphony of tastes and textures that he had almost forgotten. It was more than just food. It was a lifeline, a tangible sign that he was not alone, that he had not been forgotten. He ate slowly, savoring every bite, every sip. The coffee shop gradually returned to a state of normalcy, but it was a new kind of normal. The low hum of conversation was softer, more considerate. The people were more relaxed, more open. The simple transaction he had proposed had blossomed into an outpouring of human connection, a reminder that even in a world that can often feel cold and indifferent, there is still a deep well of compassion and kindness waiting to be tapped. The stranger was no longer just a hungry man looking for a meal. He was a teacher, a messenger, a reminder of the beauty that can be found in the most unexpected of places. And as he sat there in the warm, welcoming light of the coffee shop, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling that he had not felt in a very, very long time. The last spoonful of soup was gone and the coffee mug was empty. The stranger sat back in his chair, a feeling of warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the food. It was a warmth that came from the inside, a slow, gentle thawing of a part of him that had been frozen solid for a very long time. He looked at the $50 bill the businessman had left, then at the business card from the music teacher. These small, simple objects felt like anchors, holding him in a reality that, just an hour ago, he would have never dared to imagine. The owner of the shop came by and refilled his coffee without a word, giving him a warm, reassuring smile. He was no longer an intruder. He was a guest. As the afternoon began to fade into evening, the coffee shop started to empty. The patrons who had witnessed the performance left, but they took the story with them. They carried it out into the world, a small, bright spark of wonder in an ordinary day. The young woman who had been crying called her mother, her voice trembling with emotion as she recounted the story. The retired professor mentioned it to his book club. The teenagers posted about it on their social media, not as a joke, but with a sense of genuine awe. The story of the singing stranger at the little coffee shop began to spread, not through headlines or news alerts, but through the ancient and powerful medium of word of mouth. It was a story that was too good, too moving, to keep to oneself. The next day, a young reporter from the local newspaper heard the story. She was looking for a human interest piece, something to balance the usual reports on city council meetings and local sports. She came to the coffee shop and spoke with the owner, who, with the stranger's permission, told her the whole story. The reporter was captivated. She didn't just see a homeless man who got a lucky break. She saw a powerful metaphor for hope and the hidden potential in every human being. She wrote a story that was not just about the man's voice, but about the silence that had fallen over the room, the tears that had been shed, and the spontaneous outpouring of generosity that had followed. The article was published with a simple, grainy photo of the man sitting at the table, his head bowed over his coffee cup. The headline read, "A Song for a Meal, a Voice for a City." The response to the article was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper's phone lines were flooded with calls from people who had been touched by the story. They wanted to know if the man was okay. They wanted to know if they could help. The owner of the coffee shop became an unlikely gatekeeper for this wave of goodwill. She took messages, fielded offers, and did her best to protect the man from the sudden, overwhelming attention. She knew that his journey back to wholeness would be a delicate one, and that too much, too soon, could be as damaging as the cold indifference he had known for so long. The music teacher was the first to follow through on his offer. He came to the coffee shop a few days later and found the man sitting at the same table, looking a little less lost, a little more grounded. They talked for a long time. The man, who had once been a classical vocalist, told the teacher about his life, about the series of personal tragedies that had led him to this point. He spoke of a lost career, a broken family, and a slow, painful descent into poverty and despair. The teacher listened without judgment, his heart aching for the man's suffering, but also soaring at the thought of the talent that had been buried under so much pain. He offered him a key to a small practice room at the college, a space where he could sing without fear of being judged or moved along. He offered him not just vocal coaching, but a friendship, a lifeline back to the world he had lost. The owner of the coffee shop also made him an offer. She told him that her weekend evenings were often slow, and she asked if he would be willing to sing for her customers. She offered to pay him, of course, but she framed it as a partnership, a way to bring more music and life into her little shop. He accepted, his heart swelling with a feeling he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a hungry stranger. He was a musician, an artist, a man with a job to do. His first official performance was on a Friday night. The coffee shop was packed. People had come from all over the city, not just to hear him sing, but to show their support. They wanted to be a part of this beautiful unfolding story. The man, who had been given a new set of clothes and a chance to clean up, looked almost unrecognizable. The weariness was still in his eyes, but it was now tempered by a flicker of hope, a quiet confidence that had been absent for a long time. He looked out at the crowd, not with fear, but with a sense of gratitude. He saw the faces of the people who had been there that first day, and he saw many new faces. All looking at him with kindness and anticipation. He took a deep breath. And he began to sing. He started with the same folk ballad, the song about the lost traveler. But this time it felt different. The pain was still there, but it was no longer a cry of desperation. It was a memory, a testament to the journey he had taken. His voice was still as powerful and as beautiful as it had been that first day, but now it was filled with a new emotion, hope. He sang about the light in the valley, and this time it wasn't a distant, flickering star. It was a warm, steady glow, a promise of a new dawn. When he finished, the applause was even louder than it had been before. It was a roar of affirmation, a celebration not just of his talent but of his resilience, of the human spirit's incredible capacity to heal and to find its way home. In the weeks and months that followed, the man's life continued to transform. He sang at the coffee shop every weekend, his performances becoming a beloved local tradition. He practiced at the college, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. He found a small, modest apartment, paid for with the money he earned and the donations from people who had been moved by his story. He was no longer a faceless stranger on the street. He was a member of a community, a man with a name, a home, and a place where he belonged. The song he had offered for a bowl of soup had given him back his life. It had reminded him of the gift he had to offer the world. And it had reminded the world of the humanity that exists in every person, no matter how far they may have fallen. The story of the singing stranger became a local legend, a story that parents would tell their children, a reminder that a single act of kindness can change a life, and that sometimes the most beautiful music can be found in the most unexpected of places. The man who had once been invisible had become a beacon of hope, his voice a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity and find its way back into the light.